Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Gnomon stage here at our campus in Hollywood, California. We have a really exciting event tonight. We're excited to welcome Senior Area Designer Evan Hill to the Gnomon stage as he shares his level design process for The Last of Us Part 2. Evan is a level designer with over 10 years of indie and AAA development experience. He is currently a senior area designer for The Outer Worlds 2, and he is most known for his contributions to The Last of Us Part 2, specifically for several areas that he's going to be discussing with us this evening. Before we get started, I'd like to note that we would love to thank our wonderful sponsors, Lenovo and AMD. And without further ado, I will just pass it along to Evan to get started.
Testing, testing. Perfect. Hey, everyone. Glad to be here. So, as mentioned, we're going to be talking about some level design, specifically what we kind of learned in making The Last of Us Part 2. We're going to be focusing specifically on the museum level. So, for many of you who haven't played the game, there'll be kind of some coverage of it, but the main thing to take away is that it was a bit of an oddball level. There were no major combat encounters, no core mechanics. It had to really live and die on its pacing and our character work, which I think the team did an excellent job with. So we'll be covering how that went from concept to composition all the way through production. But first, to just kind of clarify and get it out of the way, who the hell am I? So as mentioned, I worked at Naughty Dog on Last of Us Part 2. Currently, I'm at Obsidian, working on Outer Worlds 2. I've also made a few different other games, Torment Tides of Numenera, Solar Ash. Been around the block a couple times, but again, we're here to talk about The Last of Us. And, you know, this is usually a pretty brutal game. So thankfully, we're going to be more focused on the lighter side of the experience. As I mentioned, this level was kind of unique, and I think we really landed what we wanted to out of this. Like, for Gene Park, not sure if I owe him a shirt or not still for this, but a lot of people were really affected. And yeah, this level that we designed, what was it about? So the initial concept was that we wanted to have this high point for Ellie and Joel's relationship, this extremely well thought out plan and this moment between these two characters just being there for each other. So it opens up, flashback to 3 years earlier. Joel is leading Ellie through the woods on her birthday, not telling her what's up. Big surprise, the man has found the ruins of the Wyoming Natural History Museum. It's ridiculous. She's never seen anything this involved in her life. He continues to one-up himself, and through all of that, that was what we were given. Like, she sees something, Joel delivers one of the best birthdays she's ever had, and then there's a release of tension. And then how do we take that from just a few notes on a page to a fully finished Naughty Dog quality experience? And we're gonna spend the next hour or so kind of talking through that. So talk about the talk, it's gonna be broken up into two parts. Here we've got about 2/3 of it are gonna be on the composition. Like, what did we think? How did we iterate? What frameworks did we use? And what was our just general approach? And then the last third of the talk is gonna be on the actual nitty-gritty production process. What did this look like day to day? Once we had this plan, how did we actually make it happen? And as I said, let's just jump into it. As I said, we're gonna start with composition. We've got 6 parts to this, and we're just gonna start at the top with just kind of a mantra for me as I've developed as a designer, which is that everything is story. No matter what we're doing, no matter what type of game I'm making, this is generally how I operate, because every game is experienced 1 second after another. Like, really, try to think about it this way. Like, you live your life second to second. We recount our memories second to second, and it doesn't matter if this is a fighting game or a story-based game, you're experiencing the game that way. And that means that playing a game is always a narrative experience, even if it does not have a set plot. Like, a round of Guilty Gear is a perfect example of this. There is a constant back and forth. There is a rising of tension. If you take a lot of damage, you still get a lot of gauge. Like, everything in this game's systems are designed to create really tight, wound, functionally narrative experiences without any need for level scripting or plot. Same thing with Valorant. Same thing with RimWorld. This is a game where you were just managing a space colony. There's no directorial oversight from the writer's room. There are algorithmic characters, these are basically just the settings on how often it's going to throw random things at you, but at the end of the day, it's still generating a story. And it's really key to focus on this as we just go through the rest of this talk, because it's not about what games do specifically that we're talking about. We're focusing on the player's experience, because it's about how we deal with time. Like, stories are not relegated to just things that can fit in a library. Like, this applies to everything. ESPN's entire business model is basically just narratizing sports. History and culture is that same process of narratizing events that we do not have planned out or control over. But, we are talking about a narrative game, so how does this very broad, high-minded approach even begin to help us? The thing is that I find this is really helpful for a few key reasons. It shows us that interesting moments share the same anatomy. That it doesn't matter that we're talking about making a story game. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. It's not a matter of oh, this happens to work because we're making a Last of Us game. Is it engaging or not? It helps us remove that layer of context. It also centers the player experience, like I mentioned. It's about the human cognition of the person holding the controller. It's not about our goals. It's not about what we're trying to accomplish. It has to really come down to how does the player feel, and are they feeling what we want them to? And, even more importantly, removing that extra layer, focusing on the player's experience, means that it makes us focus on iteration. At the end of the day, we try something, we fuck up, we do it again. So, kind of just breaking that down a little bit further. We're still kind of on this abstract part of the composition. All interesting moments share an anatomy. The way I usually try to conceptualize it is this 4-part process. Don't worry about needing to memorize this. It really is just like a good rule of thumb. Kisho Tenketsu is this 4-part narrative structure. It's really common in Asian literary traditions, but really all it is it's introduction, development, twist, conclusion. And again, that anatomy analogy is what helps us understand what's going on. It is not a formula. It is simply the mechanical parts needed for people to have interesting experiences and form memories. The Mario series does this surprisingly well. In modern Mario games, they set up mechanics, develop them, demonstrate some weird twist that you're not expecting, and then reintegrate it back into it. Again, we're not talking about some kind of big narrative playthrough. At the same time, it's extremely memorable, and it has that same rhythm of thinking through something, being surprised, integrating it into your thoughts that the best twists in the best Hitchcock movie operate on. If you do want to learn more about this, I would absolutely recommend Mark Brown's Super Mario World 3D's 4-step level design process on YouTube. It's absolutely phenomenal. But as mentioned before, this then leads us to the next step, which is this centers the player's experience. This fundamentally shows us that what we are doing is interacting with the person. Their psychology is the only thing that matters at the end of the day. It is our compass. It is the thing that we are operating to try and optimize. And we optimize that through iteration. You know, it's said best, good writing is rewriting. You're never going to get it right the first time. So with all of those in place, I'm pulling from a lot of different frameworks. We have Manga in Theory and Practice, Robert McKee's story, the visual story by Bruce Block. Don't worry about memorizing these now. They'll be back. But now that we have this high-minded, really abstract thing, what's the next layer down? Where do we go from, oh, that sounds nice, to what next? That's where we talk about goals and acts. So we have this concept for a level. How do we break it down? So going back to that premise, what are we trying to show? We are trying to show the high point of Elle and Joel's relationship, reinforce the conflict between them, create a compelling piece of gameplay without any conflict or combat, and have an emotional impact. And then on top of all of that, teach the player how to use the swimming controls. Simple, right? I mean, this was a high order, but when you really look at it, it's only 5 things. It's not 23. It's not, 4 hours of content. It's how do we deliver all of these key ideas in a concrete amount of time in a meaningful way. And let's just jump into it. It's like, looking at that, we were then able to isolate moments that individually meet these goals. How do we show the high point? We don't show the high point at the same time that we're reinforcing the conflict. We're not trying to get an emotional impact in the swimming tutorial, so we're able to start separating these things out. And by separating them out, we have discrete moments. Those discrete moments, we order one after another, and then we have a story. So what is this story? How do we take just a jumble of moments and then start functionally giving it something we can work with? In this case, we did break it into 3 acts. It's not as simple or clean as just 3-act structure is the right way to go. It's just that the length of the level and the number of things that we had to do roughly approximated into 3 acts. And each act in and of itself is just one of these loops. So it's just 3 stacked on top of each other. And they broke down pretty well. So we have the first act being the hike to the surprise, the second being the exploring of the museum, and the third is this much darker sequence where they get lost in the annex. And so we can just kind of step through it. This was the high-level notes that we had. So it was about 6 weeks from prompt to rough outline, and this is approximately what we got. So that first act, hike to the surprise. We flash back to 3 years, Ellie's practicing the guitar. Joel starts leading her through the forest, not explaining it. They start quipping. She starts getting on his nerves. He shoves her into the river. And as a result, right there, we're teaching the player the swimming mechanics. Again, it was a necessity to do this. We knew we needed to have this moment, and all of a sudden, we were then, instead of trying to check something off a checklist, given an opportunity to do a cool scene. We further go on. He keeps elaborating. He keeps not telling her what the surprise is. At this point, the player is getting equally frustrated. We're getting emotional impact. We're deepening their relationship. And then the twist. Huge dinosaur. We're actually in a natural history museum. Unexpected for Ellie, unexpected for the player, and while this is spiraling out, we then get the conclusion of that, which is that there is a whole museum to explore. It's not just some little punch, oh, that's cool, moving on. It is, now there is an entire another act of this thing. It's unfolding, and that's the conclusion, as we said. Setup, it's Ellie's birthday. Development, oh, they quip at each other, you learn how to swim. Twist, actual fucking dinosaur. Conclusion, there is an entire museum I now must explore. That core anatomy is what's guiding us through this. And as you can see, we're like slowly checking off these different elements. So from there, you further explore the museum, and we open up to the player this whole menagerie of small interactions where they're able to just mess with hats on dinosaurs, mess with Joel, being given a whole smorgasbord of interactions with exploring Ellie's interest in space. And it keeps escalating and escalating until Joel legitimately pulls off one of the best dad moments I've ever seen in any piece of fiction. I still can't give Neil good enough credit for this, but yeah, the man had found a recording of the Apollo space launch. Remember, this is a world without the internet working. Ellie's obsessed with space. She's never had a chance to hear this before. He's already done enough today, and he does this on top of it, and it gives her this transcendent moment as she's listening to this thing. We mess with perspective and actually make it seem like she's riding high into the sky with lights bouncing off of her helmet. And again, it delivers this emotional climax, this major twist where, again, we set up, it's like, yeah, Joel's a good dad. No, he's this much better. The tension, the actual culmination of their relationship is so much higher than we even set up with the man finding a dinosaur in the middle of the woods. And then the conclusion of that is Ellie wants to carry through, wants to see even more. Clearly, that's not all there is. This is the best day ever. Moving on. And again, we see that same rhythm. Set up the stakes. There's an entire museum to explore. We explore the entire goddamn museum. Joel one-ups himself again. As a result, Ellie wants to move forward. So they go to the next building. We see another building. The development. Ellie wants to explore the building. The building is actually very isolated and gets separated from Joel. Tension continues to rise. The museum's actually rather spooky and terrifying. We cut out the lights. We give you a lot of cover. The tension continues to rise. You think you're leaning in for a combat. The player at this point is afraid of this. Ellie's afraid of it at this point. We're completely contrasting the tones. And then she gets attacked by a boar. Not an infected, not a human, just a random animal, no actual threat. And in the middle of that, she discovers a piece of graffiti. Joel comes in to save her, but unexpectedly, this piece of graffiti reminds them of the wedge that exists between them. Again, we're reinforcing that conflict between them as this final moment of this sequence. We've read the highs, we've hit the lows, all while kind of keeping this rhythm, all while trying to just check off these different elements as we've talked about. And then walking away, yeah, the mood is different, the tone shifts, the values change. We've effectively told a story. And as mentioned, this is just that same process, stacked 3 times on top of each other. It works pretty well. It's really fucking good. And yeah, it's like we've hit all of our points. We've shown the high point of the relationships. We've reinforced a conflict between them. We created a compelling gameplay without any combat. Made people cry. You learned how to swim. That's cool. But how do we even find and develop all these moments? It's neat to talk about the larger structure, but as you're probably wondering this entire time, like, how did we figure out to take each of these steps? We understood that we wanted these arcs. We understood that we wanted this rhythm. But again, that's more of the high-minded thing. How do we take it that next step down and actually understand how we get from point A to B? The next is characters. So at Naughty Dog, one of the most fundamental principles in the way that we approach game design and story is characters drive the beats. So anything that happens needs to come as a result of a character's actions or beliefs or just otherwise the player doing something. So the next important question, once you establish that, is what drives the characters? If they're the things driving the plot along, what drives them? So understanding these people coming with us is a central part of a Naughty Dog game and a central part of designing for a Naughty Dog game. If we don't understand what makes these people tick, we're lost at sea. And, the easiest way to look at that is a person's history. What have they been through? Who are they, and what do they want? Ellie and Joel are a pretty interesting example because these two have been through an entire The Last of Us together. Like, there is a bond there. There is a traumatic history, a positive history that we're just able to unpack. But what can we do with that? The next step is that we then need to look at their histories, look at who they are, and start seeing what they want and seeing how they might act on their wants in this given situation. For Joel, it's pretty straightforward. He wants to live the life that he had before he lost Sarah. He wants to live with Ellie. It's a really concrete goal. He's having a great time. He's even bringing Ellie to a museum, partly for Ellie's enjoyment, but also partly because Sarah also loved museums. He's still in this act of proxying them. Ellie is excited to see the world possibly progress again. She has this seemingly unachievable dream of seeing the world re-enter the heights it used to be before she was born. She only half-jokingly talks about being the next astronaut. Like, she honestly wants to see the world progress. She loves space, she loves science, always looking ahead. And from there, we're already starting to see the conflicts. Because even though these two are aligned, like, they're having this amazing time, she loves science, he loves her, they're having just a wonderful experience, we also have to look at, like, what the secret wants are for these people. Because we always have that top layer. What's that bottom layer? What's the thing festering underneath these positive drives? In this case, Joel wants to hide the truth of what happened at the hospital. The fact that he basically doomed the world to live without a vaccine. He does not want anybody to know that. He's literally killed a lot of people to prevent them from knowing that. And in direct contrast to that, Ellie wants to know what Joel is hiding from her. And it doesn't matter how good this is, it doesn't fix that. So now that we have, the table set, how do we weave that into the beats that we talked about in the last section? Because really, at the end of the day, the other motivation of this sequence is to show how these two unraveled, is to show how they went from the highest point that we could render to barely speaking by the beginning of the first game, or by the second game. And so we try to find their actions and bring those actions to life. And now, I'd like to say the next part was some kind of high-minded secret technique, but it really comes down to just acting and improv. Like, some of the best moments in this level were just bullshit we made up on the spot, trying to make each other laugh or trying to get a rise out of people there. Naughty Dog has a lot of ex-theater kids. It'd be very common to come to the office and hear people yelling in a mock argument or watch somebody topple over on the floor and then look at an animator and say, kind of like that, and then have the animator do it again but better, to say, like, no, I think it should be this way. I'd love to show you some footage of this, but they would never allow me to show some of the ridiculous types of things in there. But suffice to say, the first time that we showed off the hat animations in the Leeds meeting, I think there was about 10 solid minutes of laughter. Like, people were cracking up. And it was that type of engagement with our fellow developers that really drove finding these moments. It's not a matter of, like, sitting and staring at a wall and, like, stroking your chin and thinking, like, what would this character do? It's pretending to be that character and seeing if you could get your friend and co-developer who's pretending to be the other character to have, like, a real human moment, and then putting it in the game. There's plenty of other resources to help with this. Robert McKee's story is great. Creating Character Arcs by Kay and Wayland, and The Art of Dramatic Writing by Lagros Engri is really good. They help you kind of break down all the psychological elements we're talking about, those hidden wants, character histories, and then all that builds up to that point where you can just kind of look at someone across the table and then say, like, I'm Joel. That hat is really stupid, Ellie. Why are you doing this? And just build from there. So we've got the characters, we've got our framework, we've got our high-minded goal that everything is story, but this is a video game. How does this actually play? What are we giving the player when the disc is put into the machine and they're on the sticks? And the way we kind of guided that was treating the player as if they're an actor cast as Ellie. So we found all of these moments by finding moments of improv and humanity, or bouncing between each other, And that's pretty cool. So why not give the player that same feeling? They're not just acting out something rote, but they're able to, with their own agency and decision making, have that same feeling. Like, they get to be the ones that drive Ellie's actions. They don't have the same kind of branching choice you might expect out of an Obsidian game, but when you really break it down, you still give the player a ton of options. In the same way that an actor up on stage cannot rewrite the script, but they still have tons of decisions based on timing and tone and bodily performance. They are able to craft and convey the emotions of their character, and we wanted to give the player a similar style of agency with Ellie. They're able to set the what, the when, and the why. You know, opportunities to have them express what Ellie was feeling was the core thing, explore her reactions. And it creates this great feedback loop, because unlike acting on a stage, you're collaboratively performing this character with the developers, with us. So you can decide to do something as Ellie, and then see Ellie react to you yourself as Ellie doing something, which then creates this really nice loop. Say, for example, when Joel, after having pushed you into the river, is getting you over there, you're looking at a deer, he's just appreciating nature, we put this little triangle prompt up there. We don't have to explain what it means. Everybody knows it means shove Joel also into the river. But by not making it a cutscene, you as Ellie get to decide when that happens. When you ever feel that Joel's expecting, at least. And that decision on timing really adds that satisfaction. You get to be just as smug as her, because you're the one who did the shoving. So that even afterwards, when you're just swimming around, you're still feeling like you're emotionally aligned with Ellie. You're able to glide through the water, decide when to dive, see a dinosaur, jump on the back of it and try to climb it. None of these things are essential. None of these things actually are required for you to move the plot forward. It doesn't matter whether you waited half a second or nearly a whole minute before shoving Joel into the water, but you still get to feel like Ellie. You were the one driving the action forward, which then ties further back to the fact that the characters drive the story. What drives the characters? In this case, you as the player. You get to explore all of these optional elements and kind of craft a performance of Ellie on like how spontaneous or how much she's able to interact with the environment. And to specify, like, this might seem like it's unique to this level, but really when we break down anything with gameplay, that's what the player's doing, that's what we're doing. We're giving the player tools to express a performance, a character, whether or not most of that performance is ripping demons in half, or cooking, or crafting a small town to get a raccoon landlord off your back, you know? And yeah, this is just like a further clip of just like some of the nice improvisational moments we give to the player. All of these things are optional. You don't have to interact with any of this, but as a result, because you feel so aligned with Ellie, by the time we get you into the space capsule, you feel just as seen and cared for by Joel. Like, you've inhabited this person's psyche, and then the story itself is giving you positive feedback. And it's one of the reasons why I really enjoyed working on this. And then that further carries over into the more tense scene. As we can kind of see here, one of the best tricks with this is all of this is cover height. Like, there is a part of your lizard brain, if you've played through the first 10 hours of this game to get to this scene, that if you see anything that height, it means you're going to be shooting something soon. And so working on all of those primal triggers, like, we're conditioning the player to also inhabit that persona of Ellie. Like, we're giving them stage direction without them having to read the script. Again, going back to that they are a performer on stage. They're cast as Ellie. We're letting them know what they should be feeling. And instead of it being this kind of rote call and response of like jump, and the player asking how high, it's putting a cliff in front of them and then watching them jump over. Like, you're opting into these emotions, you're opting into this expression, and it makes it all the more authentic. And yeah, that's really the core of it. Like, we're driving gameplay with this idea. And if you want more resources on that, we have Directing Actors by Judith Weston, Manga in Theory and Practice by Hirohiko Araki, and Storyboard Art by McKee. Also, if any of you are going to GDC or have Vault access, I'm going to be doing a full half-hour talk specifically on this, specifically on treating the player as a performer, breaking it down across genre, breaking it down as a much more coherent, focused talk on building rapport, building rehearsal, building alignment with the character. So keep an eye out for that. So we have our gameplay, we have our characters, the player is cast. How do they know what to do? We started hinting at that there at that last scene, but like quite honestly, we can't hand the player a script and expect them to just know what to do. Moment to moment, it's sometimes contextually easy to understand. If you have one button on screen, you know to press the button. But in addition to that, when we're navigating space, when we're navigating levels, space and lighting and visual design is that core point of feedback. It is the thing that informs your mood and direction, lets them perform without the script. And the most important things when thinking about it this way, and this is extra critical for any environment artists in the room, is clear information. Like, this is much more than just the classic Last of Us 1 trick of painting the way forward yellow. You know, you can't unsee it once you know it. They're just highlighting with high contrast the most critical thing to move forward. But it's also a balance of information. It's lighting, it's hierarchy, it's understanding just when too much information is too much, noisy environments versus too clean environments. It's always going to be contextual. But the key thing is that your environment is the thing that's informing the player what to do, what to think, what to feel. And how do we push that further? In addition to needing to convey information, we also need it to not be too boring, so we need variety. It's going to be aesthetics, verticality, traversal and interaction, stuff to do in the level. But more importantly than that, this variety, combined with the clear information, also starts leading back into generating a sense of story. That gap between what you expect and what's going on really encodes memory. So kind of going back to like what we've been saying this entire time, every moment of this thing is narrative. It's not just relegated to the cutscenes. It's not just relegated to the people talking. It's not just relegated to the parts that the player gets to do. It's not shoving a Joel in the river. It's the fact that there's a river. It's the fact that the river is clearly leading us through on a path. It's the fact that we're using it to swim. And all of that helps distill into mood and impact. You know, we're creating impression, immersion, and it's all very emotionally focused. Again, everything is story. That then focuses us back to the brain holding the controller. What is the player learning? What is the player feeling? Even here, we have Joel leading you around on this river. The river feels like this track that's moving through. But then we shift gears right before the big surprise, for example. In this case, Joel stops leading you. And then you're just given a pretty empty seeming forest to explore, but there's really clear canopies, there's really clear lighting. This was something we worked with environment on for months after just getting the exact kind of sculpture on this corridor to create this reveal and make it as impactful as possible. Like, that wouldn't have been achievable without the talent of our artists. And even further than that, like as we're setting up this larger room, we try and drip feed the player information. It's like, okay, there's maybe one skeleton. No, there's 12. Oh, is this a space area? Oh dear God, they have an Apollo capsule. Again, just that same rhythm, that same setup, that same payoff. Everything is just kind of like fractally going back to this. And also, as we've been saying, like there's just a lot of variety. All of these moments are memorable because they're different than the moment that came before. You know, we move from clean to ominous to threatening, even just pulling shit like this. This was a great ad by one of the environment artists. Just this idea that you push through a squeeze through and the camera swings up and you just see this. Feel for a millisecond like you're gonna get mauled. But yeah, again, all of this lets them perform without a script. If you want a good breakdown in terms of storytelling and architecture, I'd recommend Bruce Bloch's Visual Story again, Framed Ink, an architectural approach to level design, and then one of the like true gems, Architecture, Form, Space, and Order by Francis D. Cheng. Can't recommend that one enough. But okay, We have our high-minded goals. We've figured out how to distill it several steps down. We've got our characters. We've got our gameplay. We've got our space. We know what we want to do. It's still going to be a jumbled mess. It is just a collection of ideas. How do we actually organize it into something that's emotionally satisfying? How do we find the right rhythm? So with this level, and with most of the levels I work in general, I try to cheat, basically. Instead of going into a lab and trying to distill the perfect timing for every single moment, I just treat it like running. I let the player figure it out. I set down the track and say, go as fast or as slow as you want. Instead of trying to match it to some kind of hypothetical graph with rising action or specific beats, we just let the player season it to taste. It's like handing them a salt shaker. They make it how they like. I could do an entire talk on this, and I actually did. You can check it out on YouTube. But yeah, in short, the core premise that I wanted to achieve was to reward the players who wanted to linger, enable the people that wanted to rush, and give the player clear options on which one they were doing. So that, to start, when you see a skeleton and a button, you get to click it. Ellie says equip. Joel has a reaction. It's great. Then, when you see an entire room full of these things, you're given an expectation and a reasonable assumption of how long it's going to take. And so you as a player can then look at this and say one of two things. That's cool, moving on, or I am going to do every single one of these. And that lets us deliver on everything we're talking about. Gives them clear options, and then we try to sprinkle in surprises, like finding the hats, putting them on Joel, leading to these bigger paying off moments. But really the key takeaway is still that it's this living process. It is not some rigid formula. There's nothing, like, the last thing I want you to take away from this talk is that there is a right way or a set in stone method for achieving this. It was a lot of iteration. It was a lot of testing. Expect to get it wrong. Reflect afterwards. Keep trying it anyway. Most of your ideas are going to end up in here. It's fine. It's a really good space warmer. But this also presents a better challenge. So it's like understanding, cool, there's no right way to do this. Most of these ideas are going to get burned. The next thing we have to kind of think about, beyond the player, beyond the game, is how do you as a creative deal with the struggle of this? That's the thing that's been the most important to me over the past 10 years, honestly, is just how do you maintain the mental fortitude to keep up this process, to take something from being garbage all the way to being good. And frankly, the easiest way for me has always been looking for inspiration, finding things that kind of feed into yourself as a person, as a creative. And this has been a really good excuse for me to then jump into a secret part 7 where I get to gush about my favorite director. So I want to talk for a bit, because this is my talk and you can't stop me, about Naoko Yamada. She is responsible for my favorite film, and she, quite frankly, is my favorite director. The film in question is Liz and the Bluebird. Now, Naoko Yamada is amazing. She mostly works with Kyoto Animation, and you've probably seen some of her other work. She's done A Silent Voice, The Heike Story, but just kind of want to jump into it. We'll be really quick. Spoiler alert, though, she's basically as good as Miyazaki in totally different ways. She's a master of character and body language. Big surprise that I would find this a major inspiration. She is able to animate her characters with a sense of cognition and emotion and rhythm that's just stellar to watch. I mean, look at this. These characters in her lives are just fully on display. She's able to find individual quirks that just kind of pop and sell that there's a living, feeling human being behind these drawings. And she's so good at this, she's actually notorious for just being able to do shots from the knees down and fully convey the character and the emotion. I mean, look at that. That's messed up. How? And on top of that, she's able to make the mundane spectacular. All of her work is really focused on just human emotions. There's no grand magical plot trying to destroy the world. It's just normal people with stupid normal people problems. And despite that, the emotional intensity of it of this beautiful rhythm will emotionally destroy you. I legitimately have difficulty staying hydrated and watching her movies. They're elegant, they're bleak, and you're just gonna feel like this by the end, I guarantee it. Like, and on top of all of this, like it'd be one thing if she's just a particularly good animator who's able to get you the big feels, but she's consistently proving herself to bring out the best in other artists. She's there with everybody, helping them get through this constant process of throwing away and revision. Like this guy is Kensuke Ushio. Most of his other work is pretty grungy. If you ever heard of Chainsaw Man or Devilman Crybaby, he's the composer for that. He's also the composer for all of this. And I think it's a credit to kind of demonstrate just how much of an influence she is as a director, that the guy who would do, you know, death metal animation music with her will instead scatter paint onto some bars, fold them together, and then do this beautiful lilting Baroque music just to match her animation. And then the most selfish reason is her favorite director is my other favorite director. This motherfucker who looks like a Dark Souls boss, his name's Jodorowsky. We don't have time to get into him here. Just the main thing to know is he's this surreal, poetic Argentinian mastermind, and you're probably missing out if you haven't seen any of his work, but yeah, I've diverted enough. The main thing to take away is, like I said, inspiration can really get you through these things. Finding Naoko Yamada's work was not only just the thing that helped me be able to articulate what we wanted to do and find ways to do it in this level, but it was also the thing that just got me personally through it, through that grind, through that like just endless emotional tax of redoing and redoing and redoing and reworking things, which kind of cleanly takes us into that act itself, production. You know, how did we go from, we have this nice idea, we've taken our high-minded concepts, we've distilled it down, we've even churned through it endlessly and got it into a state that we like. Okay, how do we make this then? We have an entire team to make this with. How do we involve them? So, starting at the top, team and timelines. So, even though I was one of the first people on the ground, that doesn't mean I was one of the most important people on this project, on this level. Like I said, I was just the person that Neil went to first and said, figure this shit out. So my official title was level designer. I created the layouts and the prototypes and then coordinated with the teams at each stage and owned the level. I was essentially the producer. I was the person that if there was a problem or an issue, generally you'd come to me and then I would go to a director. At the start, it was just me and one of the level design leads, and we would talk to the directors, we'd figure things out. Once things got more figured out, the team would grow a little bit. We'd go to a 4 to 6 person strike team. That's when we were figuring things out like, oh, hats? Yes? No? Swimming? How? What does that look like? Big dinosaur. Big yes. Can we climb it? And then as those ideas took more and more form, we would just ramp up more and more. We might finally get an environment artist. We might get a texture artist to support that environment artist. Our animator would start pulling in more resources, more team members to get more discrete animation. And then at certain points, we'd get full production. The maximum amount of the people on the team that were working on this would just Eye of Sauron this thing into happening. And I was one of 10 designers. Each of us, 10 level designers, to be clear. There were technical designers and scripters, but overall, I was only managing about 4 major levels over the entirety of the production. And then each of us were given a similar workload, stretched out over 2 entire years. Like, these things were not quick turnarounds. During that entire 2 years, most of that was try something, throw it away. Try something, throw it away. Look at something, get it halfway done, make it nearly to alpha, realize it sucked, move back to prototyping phase. Again and again and again and again. And yeah, it's fundamentally a big part of the Naughty Dog process, that the secret is just that extra work. There's no magical element. I'm just a dude. I'm just here rambling. And yeah, it's the team's commitment to do that really carried us through there. But kind of going through those different stages, though, I think is going to be helpful. So that first stage, where it's just me and the lead level designer, the approach that we had was treating it as a playable storyboard. We would read the pitch, sit down with the writers and that lead, and just brainstorm. We'd just shoot the shit. Some of that improv really came in there. We would just workshop it, see if we could get a reaction out of each other. We're all gamers. We all love the story. We're all invested with everybody. So keep hammering it until the dough kind of took shape. We break with the design lead, make the first pass. I'd normally be given 1 or 2 days to just scramble and make the 3D version of a storyboard. It was garbage. It was just, like the dinosaur looks like a Gumby at one point. It's just hammering meshes into Maya the same way that you see like storyboards. Like normally we've jumped straight into Maya, no 2D maps, just getting something that's in the engine, and it was the fastest way to get from idea to testing. And we'd always assume that we'd be thrown away. I mean, like the layer that we're talking about too is like this. Has anybody seen Knives Out? This is an actual storyboard from Knives Out. Like, you can't see it, but there's probably a napkin if you just extend the frames of this. And as you can see, like, what is this doing? This is just seeing if this is a stupid and funny enough idea to translate it all the way to here. This takes just a couple seconds. Rian Johnson is not a classically trained artist. He's the one who drew this. You guys want to see what the dinosaur actually looked like? I'm sorry, I know this is a fine arts college. Again, I mentioned, I had to do this very quickly, and also I'm not an environment artist. But thanks to the immense talent of our environment art team, we were able to take it from this, once we knew that this is what we even wanted, and take it all the way to here. And thankfully, I believe, yes, this is all working. So this is some further example of like what this early block mesh process would look like. This is basically the finished version of the storyboard, so it's a little bit more polished than the dinosaur, for example, but this is what we would be iterating on. This is what we would be looking at and deciding all of these things that we were covering in the composition layer of like, is this interesting? Is this creating the right emotional rhythm? Is this being driven forward by the characters? All of these questions need to be answered at this stage. And as you can see, it's mostly just verts being shoved around in Maya. If we, let's see, can I undo this laser pointer? There we go. Can hopefully scrub it. I cannot scrub it. Anyway, let's move on to the next one. But as you can see, like this process is very multi-layered. Like this, most of this was just all my quote-unquote original art. Each of these took about 6 to 20 weeks, just solid production, most of that time being just me in a corner, checking on this, showing it to another designer, realizing it was stupid, going back, doing it again. Yeah, and this is yet another level. This one had a lot more horse riding, that's why it's much bigger, much more sprawling. You know, you're basically just riding down this entire mountainside. Let's see, just checking on time. But again, this was more than good enough. This was enough to actually provide the answers that we needed to devote the full art resources to this project. Like, as another example, look at this mess. Anybody want to guess possibly who was behind this? It's a guy called Hirohiko Araki. This guy's literally been in the Louvre. He's been published in Shonen Jump against like Dragon Ball Z for decades. This is how he sketches out his initial ideas. This man does not care about anatomy at this stage. He's just trying to find out if a page flows, if an idea is good. And then he'll do this to it. Again, like, sorry, I forgot I had this slide. Again, that's him literally in the Louvre next to his art that is being hung in the Louvre. And so yeah, so like that's what the first pitch style looks like. We walk through the block mesh with the leads, we fill in the gaps of animation and dialogue with our personal performance. So you might have noticed, like, those sequences don't have finished animation. We don't have any cutscenes at that point. This is what we're dealing with. But instead of waiting for several months while we get something in, often what would happen is one of the leads would just look at this and say, can I climb it? And then I would flustered have to be like, yeah, sure. What would that, okay, yeah, Ellie, get down from there. And then we would actually play act that scene to see if this would be something worthwhile. It turns out it was. And then I had to commit myself to every time I orally show this level to mention that, yes, you can climb it. Yes, Joel is very mad. Yes, you can jump into the water. And then we're building that more and more into every single following stage. I'd love to show you that, but we don't have any of the recorded footage. I would not be allowed to show it. But eventually, we get this key moment. Same with the hats. It honestly was just a stupid joke I made. Where it was just like, oh, maybe Ellie grabs a hat. Maybe Ellie puts it on this saber-toothed tiger. I got Neil to laugh. Then I made eye contact with my scripter, and we just shared a silent, like, okay, cool, so that's definitely going in the game now. And again, it's X-Theater kids. What do you expect? After that, we would then circle up, talk about what sucked, what worked, what didn't, throw it away and do it again. And this is a very old slide that I actually should have cut it. Either way, the main thing I keep mentioning is iteration. We rework it until it clicks. We would take these rough layouts, spend several weeks iterating. 4 to 12 weeks often was what each one of those was. 4 to 20 in some cases. Start from scratch if needed, like very often, specifically for some of the flashback levels. Even the museum itself, that second floor where the space stuff is, there were several points where that got to art alpha. We had finished models, we had finished layout, scrapped it entirely, send back to block mesh, try again. Just how it goes. You know, we let it grow and try to get a feel for it. We just try tons of different things. Like, sometimes it really is just drawing 100 different variations until you find one that you like, or having to radically remove an assumption that you were operating on the entire time. But the main thing is, once it actually gets to something that we can move forward on, we move to alpha and playtesting. At first, designers are just playing it. When it's that playable prototype is what we were kind of showing. We show it to the team, we see if they like it, we're trying to imagine hypothetical players, and eventually we get to a state of something like this, where like it's functional, like everything is able to move, you're able to kill the bosses, fight the enemies, some major sequences are going, and then we get to the really exciting part. We have all, you know, imagined this thing together, we've riffed on it, we have this idea, these preconceived notions of how this is going to work. So then we take people from totally outside of the studio and hand it to them and see how terrible it is. People get lost. People do not understand what you were going for, quizzically look at the camera and just kind of shake their head no. It's a great feeling. I'm really glad I don't have to deal with that every day. But yeah, the way Naughty Dog did it, it's changing constantly, but generally during Last of Us 2, it was about like 10 people. We'd have full playthroughs, everything would be recorded, and then really critically, people would rate the levels. They would give us feedback of like 1 to 5. And we would do this every single cycle, every 2 to 3 weeks, for most of production. If a level was anywhere near playable or finishable once this cycle started happening, we'd have to keep it. Any changes or any iterations we'd want to do from that feedback would need to be ready for the next cycle. It was a really rapid, continuous pace, but it was very, very valuable. Because, dear God, you really see how you mess up. The amount of times that I've crafted an area only to then watch in shock and horror and embarrassment as a new player just circles around it for 5 minutes, like a horse on a track, not getting anywhere. It's great. And yeah, all the changes would need to be playable. You get a ton of feedback to work with, but the really important thing though is it kept the team on a tempo. We were always moving towards this next playtest. If something got in, something was confusing, we'd address the issues and try to come up with a solution as a team. And this would let us dial things in. It would allow for more formal reviews with studio leads. We'd be able to refine features and scripting. Once something started testing well, we could just focus on more and more polish. And then you go from this wild variation in the scores to just slowly watching it tick up every couple weeks as more and more things get added. Again, it's all about iteration and rework. Oftentimes, this would be the thing driving cuts and revisions and additions. We would use the whole team for input. And yeah, jump back to layout sometimes. Sometimes levels would get taken out of the cycle entirely, and you might have 2 months where nobody gets to play it, and you're just redoing it from scratch. And that's great, but there's a more terrifying outcome, which is what happens when it finally works? What happens when, like, it's good, and you don't have to keep redoing it over and over again, and everybody looks at it and gives it the thumbs up? That's when we move from this prototype to alpha. And that's when the rest of the team gets brought in, and you watch dozens of talented artists render your garbage into something amazing. It's when the full production really hits. Like, we're handing it off to other departments at this point. We've got audio, VFX, mocap, dialogue, character, and this is not even a complete list. But just like each of these departments, some have like 10 people. Including outsourcing, Last of Us 2, I think had at least 1,000 individual developers on it at some point. Obviously a lot with contracting, 400 about in the core staff during that time. And that's when the job of the level designer really shifts. It goes from me trying to figure out what's gonna happen and more, oh God, who's going to keep this all organized? So I radically then shift from problem solver to coordinator. So I'm the one scheduling all the meetings, relaying information, managing the tasks and deadlines. We'd sit down with the directors, play the games, get sometimes literally 100 notes. We'd have to collate them and be the one to deliver them. I have to go up to animation and say, hey, remember this thing that you spent a week on? I'm gonna redo it again. And yeah, thankfully at this point that was very rare, but as the person that would have to be the bearer of bad news, it was always a very nuanced process. And the interesting thing about this is, like, you might expect there to be some grand technology or useful app in all of this. No. Really, all it came down to was face-to-face communication, some legal pads, Skype/Teams, email, and Jira. This was literally my life-saving device during the entirety of production. I just had a legal pad for every level, some tabs on it, and a long, sprawling list of everything that needed to get done and who to send it to. This is a kind of an example of what this looked like. This is not actually from Last of Us, this is from a side project I work on, but really, this is all that was mostly needed to get all of this in, because what matters is the iteration. And then, the actual really fucking hard part happens. It's good, we have most of it in. Now we need to lock and polish. Each department gets assigned its deadlines, the final hands-off moment where there's no, oh, I'll make it better next week. There's no more major changes, and we need to push it from kind of cool but janky to this mystical Naughty Dog quality. That means every detail matters. No animation pops, no Z-fighting anywhere. Everything needs to be blended properly. Any lighting mistakes? We don't do that here. Every single thing, anything that could possibly go wrong will probably go wrong, and you and the team have to just meticulously comb through every little piece. Review and play cycles continue during all of this. So you're still getting good feedback, but you know that even if a playtester doesn't notice, you know, a bush was like wigging out in its physics, it's like, Neil would probably see that. You might get a call from the studio CEO after they played through and being like, specifically to your desk, I was playing your level. I noticed something. That's what you're gonna be doing next. And as this keeps going, the notes just continue to pile up. They just keep flooding and flooding and flooding. But eventually you start to see this finished product where all of this additional scripting and bug fixing starts narrowing down, and then the team does it. It takes an entire freaking organization to do a game like this. And yeah, after a certain point, it's just kind of us as designers helping make sure the boat isn't leaking, not even guiding the thing. It knows where it's going, but we're just bailing out and keeping everybody well fed. But yeah, this group is still one of the best, if not most talented people I'll probably ever have the joy to work with, and I'm still really happy to have helped out on something this good. But yeah, that's essentially it. That's how the sausage is made. And yeah, to kind of just wrap it all up here, the real goal is you start high. You start with some kind of framework. Doesn't have to be the end-all be-all. What's helpful is that you have a framework. You have some kind of guiding methodology that you then use to iterate. You just keep trying it, testing it, trying it, testing it. Start it as rough and as fast as you can. Fail. Pick yourself back up, feed your mind and your soul with inspiration, use it to find new solutions, use it to iterate even more, and try not to stop until it's great. But even more importantly than that, rely on your team. That's all I got. Thanks for listening, everybody. You can follow me on Twitter, and then if you're curious, I also have something being announced next week that's not a video game, but should be cool nonetheless. And yeah, keep an eye out for the work that I'm doing on Outer Worlds 2. And also, go watch Liz and the Bluebird and A Silent Voice and The Heike Story. You really won't regret. And I think we have a lot of time for questions now.
Thanks so much, Evan. Great. All right, well, this is your chance. We're going to be handing the mic around. Give everybody a chance to ask Evan some questions. And just go ahead and raise your hand if you've got a question.
Thank you. Your talk was amazing. I was just curious what your degrees you hold, if any, and where did you go to school? Like I saw you speak at Sci-Arc, and I was just interested in...
Yeah. Spoiler, I went to the Art Institute. It was pretty bad. Don't recommend it. Some good people do come out of there, though. Like, I actually graduated with Frank Zhang, who's the lead character artist, still there. So it really was just the institution I don't recommend, but the main benefit is it got out of our way and let us just kind of collaborate and coordinate with the people who are really invested. And thankfully that, for me at least, wound up being enough to get me where I am. But yeah, institutionally, not the biggest help.
Great, thanks. Anybody else? Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm not super sure how to phrase this. I'll try and be brief, but are there any examples you can think of where you would pass off a level to other artists, whether they were animating characters, environmental design, things like that, and they would, their artistic ideas would either clash with yours or change your idea either for the better or the worse? Basically, another artist stepped in, had a different interpretation of what you said, and how did that impact the final product?
Short answer, constantly. As a designer, like on top of trying to offer the player the same kind of fun that I'm having building level, I always try to offer that to my artists, to my animators. It's a collaboration, and even more importantly, it means I have to do less work. So if I can give something rough and hand it off to an artist and they have their own ideas about it, I'm usually extraordinarily excited more than concerned. The museum was actually a very good example of that. The early iterations, which we don't have footage of, the museum itself was much boxier, much kind of lower budget in terms of its imagined construction, it being just a Wyoming municipal building rather than the large, sprawling, curvilinear environment that it was. And it genuinely was the artist's input that took it in that direction. They looked at it and said, like, yeah, it doesn't make total sense that the Wyoming Museum would have this budget, but fuck it. Let's make it really pretty. And then they made a really pretty version, and we all really liked it, so we went ahead with it.
Thanks so much. More questions?
I won't stand, but I have a kind of like a two-part question. So Neil Druckmann is like one of my inspirations, and it was kind of like a question like, how did you get the chance to work with him, and like how did he impact you while working The Last of Us Part 2?
Yeah, I have nothing negative to say about working with Neil. It was great overall. But yeah, I think the biggest thing was that the process I just described, he was really consistently able to do the same for everybody on the project. Like, he has a really core vision, he's really great at communicating it, but also, like, simply put, all I got to start the museum was 2 paragraphs from him. And then it was up to me and the lead designer to flesh that out. And then he responded to it. He also has a terrifyingly amazing eye for detail. Like usually when it came to that flood of notes in the end, he was one of the people generating the most, able to just, like a sniper, just notice it's like, there was a pop there. That's out of line. There's a lighting bug right here. 3 pixels, totally out of place. Or, oh, this snowbank needs to be blended exactly in there. Eyes of a hawk.
Fantastic. Any other questions? Thank you.
I came in a little late, but what other levels did you design in this? in
Yeah.
two?
I can actually probably bring up my website, but yes, specifically I was in charge of, in order, the introduction for Abby and Owen, that early tutorial section where it's the first time you get to control Abby, you're moving through the snow, and the chalet. I also did the big death scene itself, so you wandering in there and discovering all of that nightmarish terror. That was not fun, but it was very rewarding. Then I also did all of Ellie's flashbacks. So the museum, the sniper section, the bloater fight. Basically, any time where we were going back into Ellie's memories, that was my main purview. I also helped a lot out on kind of ordering the opening at certain stages. And then the other major responsibility I wound up having in the shift game was a lot of our gesture systems. So anytime that it's outside of a cutscene and it's just in normal gameplay and a character might be delivering their line and grabbing their neck, I was kind of the first person on the ground working with that system and then kind of helping refine it and give best practices to the other designers and fleshing in a few places here and there. So like there's sections of Abby and Lev exploring the Scar Village where I was the person kind of mocking up and tuning in all of those different animations, and that was a lot of fun. Also, part of the inspiration that Naoko Yamada definitely gave to me was trying to see how we could bring that nuance of body language to the moment-to-moment gameplay.
Awesome. Any more questions? Plenty.
Hey, so just kind of talking about going back to what you said about rhythm, this section of the game follows the Nora section, which is really dark and kind of bloody. How does that kind of work as a designer, kind of coordinating with the other teams about pacing and emotional connections between the section before it and then the section after it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. The short answer is just we had the benefit, it being pre-pandemic, of all being in the same room as we're working on all of this. So it was very easy to at least understand who had the scene before you and after you to help kind of modulate the tone, get a good understanding of what it's trying to accomplish. And then the other benefit was a lot of the story structure stuff was shared as a foundation. We all were moving towards strong senses of setup, development, payoff, and conclusion. And as a result, in the same way that the museum level kind of snaps together like that, because each individual section had such good fundamentals, it was pretty easy to snap them together. It was very much like episodes of the same TV show. We would be able to trust that any given level would have a full meal of an experience that we can then just lead into the next one.
Great. Any other questions?
I wanted to say thank you for the talk. It was amazing. I have 2 questions. Number 1, so you mentioned some cool movies that inspire you. Do you have any games that inspire you?
Oh, tons and tons. Too many to list, probably. It would take several talks.
Top 3, maybe?
Yeah, I would say my top 3 favorite games off the top of my head would probably be Disco Elysium, Pathologic 2, and Nier Automata. So I'm a big fan of the post-Russian, post-Soviet style of writing, seemingly. But other than that, I could not narrow it down easily. It's not just about games. It's not just about movies. It's what do I read? What else do I play? I love fighting games on top of it. I don't just play narrative stuff. I'm trying to take in as much as I can from all these different diverse places, because kind of going back to the main premise of the talk is there's no right way to do it. I could tell you what I like, but that's not some academically correct canon of things that you need to read. I have resources that I very much recommend that I covered in the talk, but that's more of just like if you want somebody to articulate and provide frameworks, they're great for that. But in terms of like finding inspiration, definitely just follow your own tastes. Develop your own taste and try and find things like it so that you can maybe speak in that same type of way. And then what was your second question?
Awesome. So my second question is, do you have any advice for people that want to work in the gaming industry specifically?
It's always changing. Like I think the best piece of advice I'd always heard from a friend of mine, Rame Ismail, is by the time you hear advice on how to break into the game industry, it's obsolete. But that said, just getting to know other people in a similar stage on your journey. If you're a student, networking with students, networking with people who are just breaking in. GDC's coming up. That's always been a huge boon for me. But post-pandemic, things are constantly shifting. Things are changing. There's great Discord communities. Even around here, there's the Game Dev Drink Up every month. There's going to be the Game Dev Perk Up consistently every quarter now, which you can find on Twitter pretty easily. So I think the next one's going to be in May, and it's just going to be in Santa Monica. And it's going to be just a bunch of game devs drinking coffee, getting to know each other. And, you know, instead of just asking me, you then get the chance to ask 10, 20 different people that same question, and you'll be able to get a lot more diverse and helpful information there.
Some really great advice. All right, more questions. There you go.
So you mentioned the importance of iteration, and I was just wondering if you've ever noticed any sort of pattern of like things that tend to need to get fixed, or not really?
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you a little bit. I heard everything up to, have I ever noticed a type of pattern?
Oh, a pattern of something that needs to be fixed when iterating on a project.
That's a really good question. Other than the cop-out answer of most of it, usually it's the connective tissue tends to be the thing you'll iterate on most. Generally, because the big sellable moments of a sequence are the things that you're focused on first. And if you change those, you then sometimes necessarily have to change the A to B part of that level. You know, if I'm adjusting the emotional payoff, kind of necessarily going to need to adjust the thing leading up to it as well. So I think that's a good thing to kind of think through, because you can save yourself a lot of time by kind of understanding where those contingencies are, like what's downstream from certain moments, so you can kind of sometimes say to yourself, like be it in just a visual composition or story composition or just anything really, it's like, oh, I'm not going to perfectly render out all of this VFX when I don't even know the timing yet. Like you can develop that, but yeah, generally, yeah, stuff that's downstream or connected to key moments is the stuff that requires the most iteration, because until you have that core skeleton laid in, it's just going to be churn. So I think like both just as a developer to help kind of limit the amount of time you need to make something, and also as a good exercise to kind of teach yourself what matters most to your discipline, kind of like focus on that. Like stuff that'll change if you change other things, that's going to be what you're iterating on most unless you're careful.
Great, thanks. Question?
Okay, thank you so much for making this talk so entertaining. I remember you said how you guys scrapped a lot of ideas. Out of those scrapped ideas, what would be like your favorite, would you say?
Ooh. It's kind of hard with retrospect. So in the flashback section with Ellie and Joel, where they confront the bloater, the inciting incident of it was something we kind of came up with during the iteration process, which is the idea that like they need to replace the strings of Ellie's guitar. The guitar is the central thing that demonstrates Ellie and Joel's relationship. Oh, they're gonna go seek out to repair it and they're going to make it better. For a really long time, they actually get to the music store and got the strings and needed to escape as a horde of infected came through. There was this whole section we had prototyped where you're crawling underneath the floorboards, things are running over you, Joel's being a badass, and it just wound up being a bit too much in terms of scope. It wasn't really worth the squeeze. And we wound up cutting it entirely to the point now where the story is they don't even get to the music store. They don't get there at all. They don't get the strings. They just kind of say like, well, we barely survived. I don't want to fight another bloater. Let's leave and go home. But it's hard to say that it's like, I don't know if that was like necessarily my favorite idea, because I actually do like what the story says now, where it doesn't repair their relationship. It's actually more authentic to where the story's going, that they don't find the strings. They don't fix what's going on between them. It gets deferred constantly, specifically by the painful struggle of the way the world is. A bunch of infected. They find some kids that committed suicide as a result of getting infected. Like, they can't repair this relationship until the world is fixed or something else breaks. But yeah, other than that, there's like other ideas that were on the cutting room floor. Like, I was the systems person experimenting with like horseback combat with infected. And like, the reason that got cut was just, it wound up being too complicated for how fun it was. You know, for a little bit it was like, you might be on Shimmer's back and an infected could like latch onto you and you could kick it off and run them over and all these other things, but making that interesting with all the animation support and with everything else, like, it wound up just not being feasible. There were better, cooler things that we could spend our time on. But yeah, there's a lot of good stuff, but I think most of my favorite ideas really made it into the final version of the game.
Thank you.
All right. Did you have a question? Okay. All right. Any other questions? All right. Okay. I'm gonna get him.
Hello, I really enjoyed your presentation a lot. As a practicing level designer and stuff, I was kind of curious, like, what was your early journey like, and kind of how did you practice level designing, especially like now since there's so many tools kind of accessible to us. I'm just kind of curious how you did it back then, and then if there's any tools that you might recommend now in learning or anything like that.
Yeah, I mean, like right now, it's really just learning the engines. Having a good foundation in Unity or Unreal is really helpful, but also what might be helpful to hear is just kind of how I ran kind of like the career calculus as I was starting out. Looking at the industry, I'd always loved narrative, always wanted to contribute to storytelling, but I had to be confronted with the fact that there were a lot of very established writers. You know, there are people like Neil or Chris Avallone or Amy Hennig who like are at the top of their game and are going to continue to get better. It's not even a matter of like, if I could get to the level that they're at, it's that they're going to get better at the same speed I'm probably going to get better. So rather than trying to compete directly by trying to become a writer when there's somebody with 15 years of experience ahead of me, I tried to look at what kind of niche I could fill as a designer. If I could walk up to a dedicated writer and say like, oh yes, you are excellent at prose and, you know, building scripts. I can do all the stuff around you. I can, you know, build the level. I can script things together. I can build prototypes. And so I kind of tuned my learning after realizing that to be, frankly, a bit more of a tech artist at that point, just making sure I knew how every singular component worked. And I think that still holds true for level design in general, is just you want to be genuine jack of all trades. You want to be able to know how an animation gets into the engine. You want to know how VFX work, how the basics of every possible component or facet of development works. You don't need to master any of them, but you do need to be able to work with everyone doing them. You need to be able to talk to VFX artists, understand what their needs are, what their workflow's like, and as a result, you'll then be able to kind of synthesize more and more into the final product, because a level is just that confluence of everything the game is. It is, you know, whatever you're playing is everything there. So yeah, I think being as broad as possible and just kind of being endlessly curious about everyone else's process will probably get you the better results.
Great. I believe there's a question over here.
Two questions. First, the block mesh you showed looked really kind of like early animatics for kind of like theme parks and stuff like that. Do you guys kind of ever reference like rides and kind of the pacing and kind of cinematics that way, or like at least like team crossovers when it comes to kind of framing and pacing a level?
Yeah, that's actually a pretty interesting comparison, because, well, it's not directly like, you know, we would look at something and say like, man, we're going to make it like Cars from Disneyland. there are a lot of fundamentals that exist in the way theme parks are designed and the language and tools that we use specifically at Naughty Dog and in other places. Like, thanks to Walt Disney, anytime you have a landmark in the distance that is generally your long-term goal, the proper technical term for that is a weenie. I'm not kidding. The reason for that is he noticed when he was going around his kitchen, if he had a hot dog in his hand, his little dachshund would just follow him around the house. And so he's like, it's a weenie. And then he's like, my customers are the same. If I put the Magic Castle there, it's like I'm holding a hot dog for them. They're stupid. I don't think he added that last part, but legitimately, if you look at how Disneyland, next time you go there, is constructed, you can see the spire of the central castle from anywhere in the park. It is this unifying organizational element that you're able to use to tell where you are in space. So as a result, there is a huge overlap in the approaches and the tools that people like Imagineers and architects use and that level designers daily use and reference. So yeah, there's a ton to be, like, there's a ton to see there. So I would say, like, if you're curious in those types of structures, there's some great YouTube channels that are specifically just on, like, the design of Disneyland. And they'll dig into things like, oh, all of the hidden shortcuts and passages, the way that they use a lot of, like, snaking roads and pathways to give a sense of space that you never, like, see a straight shot. Like, Disneyland could have been constructed like a mall, where maybe you're in Tomorrowland, and if you squint, you can just stare across the entire thing into Frontierland. That'd be garbage and kind of awful and give you a weird sense of vertigo. But again, they considered all of that. They considered that sense of presence. But yeah, in addition to that, like, I also draw a lot from, like, storyboarding techniques, environmental design, gallery artists, performance artists. There's a lot to be learned from a lot of different places.
Thank you so much. And then my other question was about, you showed that earlier, the task list for this level, which seemed kind of, like you said, modest. And then, like, compared to, like, something like you said, the introduction level with Abby and Owen, where it's like, all right, here's a bunch of characters, and you need to learn to crouch and climb and squeeze and fight infected. So, like, how is, like, the approach? Is there a different approach to that when the bullet list is much longer?
Yeah, frankly, there is. Like, with kind of understanding that when the bullet list gets long, doing a tutorial, like as many of you might hear, doing a tutorial is generally significantly more difficult than just doing a level where the player already learns, because you need to ensure that they have the information to continue, like that they don't miss something or don't press the wrong button thinking they pressed the right one. There needs to be this clear, constant feedback. So one of the tricks with that sequence was creating a narrative that was kind of agnostic to what was going on. Like with the museum sequence, it was very present. It was very like, oh, we're seeing a river and we're talking about a river. Oh, we're seeing the dinosaur and messing with that. For so much of the movement mechanics and the flow between Abby and Owen, honestly, like, when I got the level, I just took out a piece of paper and then kind of just sketched a big line and then another line. And I said, in this part, they're kind of getting closer. And then in this part, they're pissing each other off. And, like, that's it. Like, we knew that it's like we wanted to have them have this rhythm where they're, like, getting closer and then a little further apart and getting closer and a little further apart. And then the core tension was just like, oh, Owen's taking Abby out in the morning on their own. This is weirdly romantic. Is he, like, trying to reignite something? No. His girlfriend's actually pregnant and she thinks her ideas are terrible. So Abby gets this big, you know, emotional hit, but because we were able to distill the story down that clearly, it didn't matter. It's like, oh, and then they crouch here, and then they squeeze through here. They're having this conversation kind of in spite of the environment as they're doing it. So then the player themselves gets invested in this, like, escalating conversation and then figure out and, like, kind of teach the mechanics to themselves naturally. And then afterwards, when they separate, we're able to do a lot more concrete things like, this is where the stealth section is taught. This is where combat is taught. This is where this is taught. And that then shifted from, oh, here's the emotional story, to how do we make, like, an action choreography that includes all of these different bullet points. So in some ways, it's easier in that, like, by having all the bullet points, you know all of your essential scenes, so you know how to order them generally logically. But in the other, it is also really hard because to get all of them right, you also then need to come up with a framework that is a bit more robust and won't completely derail if you have to radically change a part in the middle.
Thank you.
Some great insight. Thank you. Any question back here?
Hi, so I'm a huge fan of Alexandra Neonicus, so I believe I actually did Viz Dev for the museum level, but I guess I was just wondering, at what point do you bring 2D Viz Dev artists onto the project? Because if you're constantly iterating the level, are they always constantly doing Viz Dev for potential levels, or do you wait until you have a solid concept and then bring them on?
It varied a lot. Usually we would just get like a good tone piece or a few key snapshots for concepts. So if you generally like look at the museum levels concepts, we kind of got those around the same time we were finishing the first lay-in. So we would kind of give them the pitch, and then we would get something. There was like a version where the concept shows the moonlander out kind of in the wilderness. But in terms of just coordinating involving 2D artists, it really varied. In the case of Alex, like, they were one of the best resources I could have possibly asked for. They were so motivated and had a deep love of paleontology that we just ran with. Like, they gave us, they came back with like multiple notes on multiple occasions where it was just like, here's everything wrong with this level right now. Like, specifically like, that's not a duckbill. This is how you pronounce that one. This one, like, why do you have this velociraptor skull this big? They're supposed to be this big, and this, and like, they wound up being like our kind of authenticity checker for like specifically the dinosaur section. And it was like really helpful kind of like noticing early on that they were like really invested in that component and then providing them the space to give that feedback and coordinate themselves. As for like how Naughty Dog generally works with 2D in general, there's like two layers for it. Obviously we have concept, and they can help initially, like say the chalet got a concept initially before I even started on it because it was so critical to a lot of key things versus with the strings flashback, that was mostly block mesh, and then concept came in to give like tone pieces based off of the block mesh. So it's pretty varied there. And then addition to that, like there's an under-discussed layer for like 2D and graphic design in just general like environmental graphic design. So things like graffiti, pamphlets, product design, any type of like visual around us, from like logos to advertisements, like generally more and more there's like dedicated roles for 2D and graphic design contributions there. And say for example on Outer Worlds 2, it's such a major component. Like the main thing, like one of the main factions is this massive corporate juggernaut. Like they have advertisements everywhere. We work really closely with 2D and graphic design to just get that to feel right, to get murals looking good, to get like bas-reliefs feeling on point with the level design. So it varies a lot, but yeah, also in particular, Alex was, I think, one of my favorite people I worked with on the entire production.
Great, thanks. So now we have a couple questions from Twitch. And the first one is, you mentioned in the combat section of the museum that the height of the exhibits connotes shooting cover. How conscious are you of the size language when designing a level? Does that impact or limit the way you design?
It's kind of essential. So it's not a matter of just like us doing it because that's how cover looks. It's very, very vital for the animation system to work. Cover height is set because if you or an NPC needs to aim over the cover, that animation does not adjust easily. So cover height has to be set, otherwise you would get an issue where maybe I aim through and just clip through the geometry or hover above it. So there's some amount of range, but generally you'll find that in any game that has restrained mechanics of any variety, like be it Mario or Zelda or Halo, that those metrics are there. They're kind of just fundamentally like the necessary proportions to make the game work. And it's also not that dissimilar from how real-world architecture works. Doors are generally the same size. What are the proportions and gaps in a supermarket? car shapes, road design. It's really just based off of a lot of those restraints and necessities. And so there's like, for every game I generally work in, there's almost always like a metric sheet where it'll tell you, it's like, all right, say for Last of Us 2, it's like, oh, squeeze-throughs need to be 1/2 meter or less wide, but they can't be smaller than 0.4. Vault over cover is like 1.14 meters. Slopes can't be outside of this range. Any areas in a horse traversal area needs to have this amount of width and this amount of height. And that's generally where those metrics initially come into. And then as a player, you just kind of realize that a lot of the cases, they'll internalize those shapes and those proportions that, you know, when there's a combat section, oh my God, there's a bunch of chest-high walls here. I wonder what's gonna happen, kind of thing. And we tried to get better and better at hiding it, and I think we did a really good job in 2 compared to 1, because we were just able to adapt to more shapes, but there still is just this very like obvious transition that just needs to happen by necessity, because an interesting combat arena has a distinct shape that is very different than like a space that's just interesting to walk around in. So we're just kind of using that to, in that case, play without expectation to kind of trigger that like deeper, like subconscious response to the space.
Great, thanks. All right, we kind of maybe a little bit covered this earlier, but maybe we can put a different twist on it. Do you have any advice for the key things that a junior designer should know, learn, considering when being considered by a studio like Naughty Dog? Maybe also we could add in like, are there key things that you would want to see maybe in a portfolio as far as like different types of projects that would be good to show?
Yeah, I can kind of speak into it in different layers too.
Yeah.
So there's generally like different subclasses of design, so always kind of know what audience you're building towards. Obviously I can speak to level design, but I've also worked as more of a technical designer and scripter. In both cases, honestly, even just evaluating applicants myself, the thing that I don't see enough of and seems to work really consistently is on your portfolio showing something that's being played. Like make a level and don't just show a bunch of stills or just a run through of it. Try to get footage that demonstrates that you handed it to somebody who has not seen it before and they can navigate their way through. Like that's just doing the thing at that point. You're showing, it's like, hey, I can take an idea out of my head, put it into a game engine, and then have somebody not get lost in it. Like that's, you know, people can help with the technical side. People can help with like the creative side. As a junior designer, you're not expected to come in and have the full toolkit available. But if you can do the core thing that the job requires, you're gonna be able to get a lot further. When it comes to technical design, I would say the same type of thing. You know, showing stuff that people play and engage with is always gonna be extremely helpful. But overall, being more technical is never gonna hurt you. The more that you can demonstrate that like you know an engine really well, can program, understand a lot of like really commonly used mathematics for whatever genre you're working in, be it like, you know, simple calculus for blending or vector math stuff, like that's like you're never gonna, nobody's ever gonna look at you and say, oh, that's useless. Like that's always going to be of immense value. Additionally, when it comes to more like creative design, specifically with like level design, another really good skill to demonstrate is the ability to deconstruct and rebuild different styles. So doing like a master study, the same way that some of the visual artists here would, where they try and recreate a masterwork by breaking down and seeing its proportions. So as a level designer, just taking a level you really like and trying to recreate the block mesh version of it, you'll learn so much. But then if you can further like showcase that in a portfolio that like, hey, I noticed this is how this works and this is how this works, that's great. And even more, the real secret sauce is you'll probably get a design test, and if you can turn in a layout that the team feels is like something they would make, you're gonna get the job. And the best way to do that is to break down the previous work.
Fantastic, it's really helpful. All right, so that's all we have time for tonight. So if we could all give Evan a big hand of applause for this great performance.
thanks everyone for coming tonight. If anyone needs parking validation, Melissa is on the side of the room here. She's raising her hand. See Melissa to get a ticket.